So this has been a pretty common sight lately. Engine bay all torn apart, alternator missing. Been driving it without an alternator for about the past 2 weeks. I've just been driving purely on a battery power off the deep cycle in the front, deep cycle in the back, and I've even added a second deep cycle in the rear to increase some electric charge time. Turns out the alternator has been giving me a lot of grief. It's been overheating. One main reason is where it sits right here. It almost sits right on top of this exhaust manifold, which definitely radiates a lot of heat in the alternator. And one of the primary enemies against an alternator is heat. What that would cause is the rectifier assembly would be the first thing to fail. The solders would melt, would reflow, and they'd lose connection. There wasn't any mechanical connection on here, so once the solder gave, that was it. And if you're not completely stranger to electronics, solder is a very poor conductor when used on its own. On top of that, on top you really don't see any failed diodes, but if you look a little bit closer on the bottom, you can see these diodes started to rupture a little bit. So with this being a 6-phase alternator, if you lose a phase, it's not the end of the world. It's not that rough, but here I can easily tell one went down, another one was starting to have problems too, I suppose. So this is the rectifier assembly. It's composed of 12 press fit diodes. I decided to replace that. What I did was I built my own rectifier assembly, which is much larger. While this press-fitted one was pretty impressive, I'm told it uses 60 amp press-fit diodes. This one I use 80 amp stud-fitted diodes. There's 12 diodes because it's a 6-phase alternator, so you need one diode for the positive leg and one diode for the negative leg. You can kind of see the construction here. One heat sink is battery positive while the other heat sink is battery negative. They're isolated by these pieces of plexiglass. And this stud block on top serves as the connection point to the alternator windings, where you have one phase each wire and connect one phase here, 2 phase here, 3 phase, and so on. So one main reason of relocating the rectifier was, one, to remove components out of the alternator, because the alternator itself gets incredibly hot. One, sitting next to the exhaust manifold, and 2, the alternator itself gets hot from the amount of current it's generating. So removing the rectifier assembly out of that will remove a lot of heat from the alternator, and because we made it bigger with actual passive cooling as opposed to just this has a few drilled holes in it and there's a kind of a shitty fan inside of on the alternator rotor assembly, that kind of keeps this cool, but this will be able to stay a lot cooler because it'll be farther away from the engine, kind of on the firewall, and the heat will be able to radiate through the heatsink fins, and this is quite a large thermal mass. So I had this alternator apart and I had to unsolder these guys, and the solder, as I said, was the main component to fail, but that also could be because if this rectifier heats up, if you're dropping 1 volt across each diode at full load, I think that's somewhere around 15 watts a diode, which times 12 is some math I really don't want to think about this late at night. So this itself would generate a fair amount of heat, and going through the solder would cause the solder to melt because more resistance causes more heat and it would flow. So when I made this guy, I used barrel crimps to crimp this 10 gauge wire onto what appears to be 14 gauge stator windings. So after I crimped that, I would also flow solder over there as an extra precaution, and because it shouldn't be getting as hot, it shouldn't reflow, but even if it does, it still has the mechanical connection to work on. It was then all heat shrunk. The windings are at the connection points are still behind this back face. They're folded over and they come out in these locations. They have heat shrink on here to prevent chafing on the outside of the alternator casing, as well as add a little bit more of a thermal resistance to any radiant heat, because as it comes out of the alternator, it'll be covered in some loom, and obviously the loom can't go inside the casing, so that's what the idea of the heat shrink tubing is there for. So I'm gonna install this in the car now and hopefully all goes well. Alternator loosely mounted, ready to tighten the belt. This is what hurts the most. Once I do this, there's no turning back. Oh, who am I kidding? That was a long time ago where I couldn't turn back. Flat meter at 400 amps on the charge cable. And here we go. Appears to be putting out 50 amps. There we are, we're at 13.9 volts. Sounds healthy. That's cool. I'm gonna go get a heat gun now.